All right. Now it's recording. Very good.
Rabbi, can I make an announcement?
An announcement, yes.
We're looking for a couple of volunteers to help with polishing the silver for the holy days. We're going to get together on Thursday the 15th of August. If anybody's interested in speaking about it.
Okay. If anybody would like to help polish the silverware, it's a wonderful help, especially this busy time before high holidays. So
Then when you see
talk to
a dark
Karen.
open up, nice,
And
so sparkling, you really feel good about
As
it.
it shines out, exactly. And remember, during the Ela, we give a chance for everyone to come up to the Aron HaKodesh, so you get a close-up look at the silver. Of course, after all the days of high holidays, by the time we get to there, the rimonim would have been taken off and put back on, and taken off and put back on. So there might be a few fingerprints. I hope you don't mind, but it'll still look stunning by then. All right. So I think we are mostly here. Most people have finished their other work in the building, and now we're time for a little study. So we are now in Parashat Re'eh, exactly, and there are a ton of mitzvot. We're only going to look at a little section, of course, as usual, but the section we're going to look at has to do with the poverty legislation of what Torah commands us to do in the case of people that are poor, that are less fortunate around us. And if I were going to ask you, not necessarily what you think Torah says, but just for yourself, what you think can be done to help the poor. Abriut. You can give them a tissue, or what can we do? What can be done? What can we do to help someone that is poor? Wow, not a lot of ideas.
If we could, if we have it available,
Mhm.
give them a job.
Okay, so a job is way up there on the list of things that would be most helpful.
Possible.
What? But it's not always possible. Not all of us are business owners with jobs available, or even able to offer a small job around the house either. So sometimes we can't do that.
Teach them a skill.
Okay, sometimes we can teach or help them get teaching so that they'll have a skill that can then translate into a job that someone else will give to them. Exactly.
Shelter.
Shelter. For those that are so poor that they don't even have a place to live, providing a place where they can be safe and protected from the environment is very important. What's that? Money? Because everyone feels better when they have money. What's the money for? Right, so the money isn't necessarily just in and of itself nice. It's there for doing food, shelter, clothes, sometimes for the job itself, in terms of buying the tools of a trade, or being able to pay for the commute or to get a car so you can get to work and other things. So money can fill in for a lot of these other direct help, and all of these can also be done individually. You can give someone clothes, you can give someone food, and all so on. And then you can also either give the money or give free services. Free services in the form of medical care, free services in the form of maybe financial tutoring or counseling, free services in the teaching aspects that we've talked about. There are lots of things that we can donate our time to help someone benefit themselves when they are in bad situations. What about an unlimited 0% interest credit card? What about an unlimited, no limit, 0% interest credit card? That's not a good idea? Why not?
We come from Massachusetts, and what we found are we have given people that, and they use them for tattoos, liquor, cigarettes, and trips to the casino at Foxwood. And so many of the EBT cards have been slid to the ATM machines at the casino.
But those are the staples of life. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, do you expect a person to live a good human life without going to the casino?
I'm right. I'm getting straight.
How inhuman of you.
Get your priorities in order.
But why is it? I mean, we said that we're okay to give someone cash, but we wouldn't give them an unlimited credit card.
Well, money's a problem too.
But even money's a problem.
Money, you have a limit.
Money, there's a limit.
You can, whatever you feel you can afford or give is what you give. There's a limit, that's it, there's a cap.
Once I've given you $50, you don't get to spend 51.
That's
you,
right.
you only get to
That's
spend the
right.
50.
Whereas unlimited, that's a little risky on the part of the giver.
Gift card.
A gift card, but also again, it's limited at a certain.
It's okay.
Right, there's a maximum amount that can be used. So, are we saying then that that kind of credit doesn't have a role to play in the helping of poor?
I think that's a poor way to teach poor people to manage any kind of finance or their lives in general.
Right.
Before they can afford what they're doing, to have a credit card
Mm-hmm.
is just, to me, the wrong way to go.
And the other issue is, if you give me an unlimited credit card, why would I work? I'd be stupid to go to work if I have all the money I need on the card. Just keep doing it.
We might think that, although Torah seems to have a very different idea. What is very interesting is that we all assume that credit is something that is earned when you don't need it. I'm sure that you've all seen those commercials that say, special financing deal for new cars, 0% financing for approved credit. And for approved credit means that you're at the bottom or the top of the credit scale? The top. Which means that we extend.
The higher your credit rating, the lower your interest.
Right, the higher your credit rating, the lower the interest that you pay. And the reason for that is, in the business world, that's not as risky, exactly. By extending you credit, I am taking a risk. The more I think you're likely to pay it back, the less risk I really feel I'm faced with, and therefore I can reduce the interest rates to less and less because I'm not worried about getting my money back. I'm sure you're good for it. But somebody who's poor, who doesn't have a good credit history or doesn't have any credit history, any record of paying back debts, you get the special 25% APR rate on this because I'm not sure whether you're going to pay this back, so in the meantime I want to get everything out of you that I can. And that makes sense for business. But the irony is Torah does not imagine credit as an instrument for the wealthy. Torah imagines credit purely in the terms of an instrument for helping the poor. That's it. Go home. No. Torah views credit as something you do to help someone else that is poor. One of the many apparatuses that were available. Now, why would you use credit rather than doing these other things? Why give someone a loan?
Well,
Especially an interest-free loan. Just give them a gift.
Having worked with the unemployed and disadvantaged in the past, I know that many of them, most of them, have a sense of dignity and want to have some control over their lives, which could be spiraling out of control.
In every other way, exactly.
And by giving them credit or a limited amount of credit, they are able to make that determination. They sometimes need guidance as far as counseling as to how to handle money, how to handle a budget. And those are things that we don't do enough of in our high schools with the young people.
Or who are getting a very different type of education at home that doesn't show responsibility.
And many of the people that I work with have no idea how to open a checking account, or what to do to pay bills by check. Everything is on a cash basis.
Right. So the two main points, if I can summarize what you said, is that there is an element of dignity that comes from receiving a loan with the intention of repayment that says, yes, right now I need help, but I don't imagine myself as being perpetually in a state of need, and so I would accept a loan where I would be ashamed to accept a gift, and I will repay that loan. And for many other people, or perhaps the same category, but as a secondary purpose, the process of repaying a loan, of learning how to manage one's budget and to work out how this is going to affect what I do month by month, can be a very important part of a full financial education of how one handles money, finances, budgets, and all those things, which can seem simple once you get the hang of it, but can be extremely complicated and can contribute to ongoing poverty if the person hasn't been properly taught how to make this work. Very good. Not exactly the main reasons that Torah is looking for here, I think. Certainly the dignity, absolutely, but Torah has also in mind another very, very important person in this equation. And this might be something that's not on our mind, because most of us probably don't go around making loans to people in need. We let banks do that, we let other agencies do that. But if you were told you need, or you could, make a loan to someone of $1,000, or you can make a gift to someone of $1,000, which one do you think would be easier for you to accommodate into your financial system? A loan. One of the reasons why the Torah talks so much about extending loans to the poor is because by making loans possible and both beneficial for the person who receives it and possible to be reclaimed by the person who gave it, it encourages more people to participate in the assistance of those who are poor. If I know that giving a loan will mean my money will eventually come back to me, then I can accommodate giving you a few $100s today, whereas I couldn't accommodate just giving you a check free and clear and let that money disappear from my overall assets. I'll give you an example. Penelope's here, so we can use the we. When we were in our first year of rabbinic school, one of my colleagues had a holdup on the financial aid system, and it meant that for his first month's rent in his apartment, he didn't have enough in the account. He would get it as soon as the financial aid was all taken care of, but at the first month he didn't have it. So we loaned him the money for his first month's rent. Now, if we'd had to give him the money for the first month's rent, we probably wouldn't have been able to afford it because we were also among these starving rabbinic students. It's just that we had a little bit more in our account at that moment, and knowing that in another few months it would come back to us, we could easily accommodate making that loan at that time, whereas we would not have been able to accommodate a gift at that time. And so we were able to participate in this act of tzedakah and assistance to a fellow human being that would have been denied to us if the money hadn't come back. Sound good? Okay, so with that in mind, with the notion that the loan and the extension of credit without interest was a primary poverty legislation in the Torah, we're going to see how we wrangle that with what we're going to read in the Torah as well. Okay, because there's going to be a little bit of a wrench into this, and then we'll see how our sages have dealt with it. So, we are going to begin on chapter 15, which is on page 1076. It's chapter 15 of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. How we doing? Everybody got it flipped? Near enough? Good. Volunteer. Please.
Every 7th year you shall practice remission of debts. This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. You may dun the foreigner, but you must remit whatever is due you from your kinsman.
Wait a minute. Hold on a second. I mean, I just spent the last 15 minutes talking about how wonderful it was that Torah set up a system where even people who weren't necessarily wealthy could still help someone else by giving them a loan, because they would have the assurance that the loan would be repaid. And now what have we introduced?
Don't give it to a foreigner.
Well, you can give it, actually giving it to a foreigner is fine, because the foreigner you can make sure they repay, but one of our own kinsmen, someone else who's within the people of Israel, what happens every 7 years?
All the money you have to pay it back, all your debts.
Cancel.
And the 7 years, it's not 7 years from the day you gave me the debt. It's, they proclaim 7 years, so if you gave me the debt last month, you can then pay it back this month.
Correct.
Maybe. If I don't have it, take me to court.
Well, and usually the terms are set out a little bit more clearly than that, but if the sabbatical year comes and the debt has not been repaid, the debt will never be repaid. The debt is canceled. So just imagine for a moment the people who are living under $20, $30, $40, $50,000 worth of credit card debt. Every 7 years, the credit card just gets zeroed. And the question would be, well, then I can start again. And so credit cards there's one reason why credit cards are not a perfect analogy to this, of course, is that credit card companies are in the business of making money, not of helping the poor. And we've seen that from a number of their policies, sometimes quite counter, apparently, to the idea of helping the poor. But also credit cards allow someone to spend without asking for the loan. It's almost a granting ahead of time, which can be one of the reasons why people get into so much trouble, because they feel they've got the money because they've got the credit, as opposed to a loan where you actually had to go and ask and get it arranged, where there's a bit more of a sense of responsibility rather than this magical piece of plastic. But what do you think the effect would be if this was in place now in the United States? If every 7 years there was a national remission of debts, and debts were all zeroed out. Disaster? wait, so everybody here is debt-free. No one's looking to get their debts canceled.
This country will be bankrupt.
The country would be bankrupt. People would stop loaning. Why would they stop loaning? Because you're not going to get it back. Because then there's no longer a loan, is it? Now it's a gift. It's a gift that I might see again if the 7 years don't roll past. But if they do, then goodbye. It's now what was my loan, what I was able to reasonably accommodate as a temporary absence from my assets, now becomes a permanent loss. And for many people, that's not a loss that they can easily afford to accommodate. And so the next time someone comes to them asking for a loan, they would have to say, sorry, I can't loan you anything. Because if I loan it to you, I won't get it back.
At what time in history did they stop observing this rule of the...
We'll get there. So the question, when did we stop doing this? And by the way, don't think you can go to a credit court in America and say, but I'm Jewish. Doesn't work. That doesn't work. But we are going to talk about when this stopped, or if it stopped, and what the implications are. But it's an excellent question. You're just ahead of the game. All right, well, let's keep reading, because we want to make sure that we understand that the Torah was not naive, and it wasn't as though the Torah didn't understand these problems.
There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion. If only you heed the Lord your God and take care to keep all this instruction that I enjoin upon you this day. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen, in any of the settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs.
All right, so first we're told if we do everything that God asks, there will be no poor. And then reality, there will be poor. And when there are poor, you need to make sure that you are not hard-hearted, that you open yourself up and that you open your hand, not just your words, and make sure that you help them. And then we get this caution.
Beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily, and have no regrets when you do so. For in return the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land.
All right, so the Torah is not naive. God's no dummy. I mean, that's should be a bumper sticker, I think. But God understood the same thing that we immediately came to realize, that if we are going to remit debts every 7 years, that means people are going to be rather disinclined, especially near the end of that 7-year cycle, to making a loan to someone, anticipating that they're probably never going to see that money again. And what's the antidote according to Torah? Keep giving it. Don't be a jerk. You're right. You may never see that money again. Yes. Give it anyway. Don't be a jerk, because God will bless you for all that you do. And that's better than having whatever money you might lose from this person who is poor, that needs it and won't repay it because of the canceling of the debts.
Yeah,
One hand first, then...
Yeah, the first sentence seems to contradict the last sentence, David. The first sentence says, there shall be no needy among you.
Yes.
And then at the end they say, there will never cease to be needy ones in your land.
Correct. And we're going to wrestle with that in a few minutes, Jerry.
Okay.
Ah! No?
That's all right, I lost it.
Okay. Now, the Torah goes on, and we don't have time, but the Torah goes on to continue discussing the status of the release of slaves, of those who have sold themselves in order to pay off debts or because they have become bankrupt at one point or another. And you can perhaps imagine what it would be like in the modern world if someone was unable to meet their debts, if they had to declare bankruptcy, if the court said, well, I'm very sorry, you know, Mr. Jones, you're unable to pay your debt. We will, even after selling all of your assets, you can't zero out the balance that you owe to your creditors. So you will be sold, and the money will be distributed to your creditors, and you will work for a period of years to pay off this debt. And every 7 years, those people would then be set free. So we're not talking about slavery in the sense of like we saw in this country, much to our shame. We're talking about a temporary status of someone who is indebted and is working through their debt, as it were, and more importantly, is receiving a place to live and food to eat, and usually clothes as well, in order to make it through to the point where they can then be put back on their feet again. Which the Torah goes on to describe, that once their period is done, they don't leave empty-handed, but that they are rewarded, they are gifted by their owner with many things as they leave, so that they can be put back on a firm standing and be able to hopefully not ever enter such dire straits again.
I did remember.
Congratulations.
We have to give charity anyway. Loans aren't charity, right? I mean, if you're going to give 10% each year of your loan, so what's the big deal that we're giving somebody a loan and we don't get some of it back, because that goes to our charity, not our tzedakah.
So why would you give a loan? You would just call it tzedakah and be done with it. Just call it tzedakah and be done with it.
Assume it's tzedakah.
Right. Well, part of the issue is, and certainly there's nothing in the Torah that says you shouldn't simply make it a gift to this person. But there are circumstances, partly from what Marion said, where some people would not want a gift but would be willing to accept a loan. And there are people who at times will have the resources to make a loan that, again, as I said, they can't write it off permanently. You know, maybe because of the growing cycle, maybe because of the way their merchandise has just sold and now they're waiting for another shipment to come back, they've got some cash on hand that they can temporarily loan. And that will help this person. And it's not about just meeting their minimum obligation of giving tzedakah. It's they have the resources to help this person. And even if they've already given plenty to tzedakah, even if they've done everything that the minimum of the law demands, they could, if it were a loan, help this person now. But if it's going to be just more tzedakah, more money gone that will never come back, they wouldn't be able to afford that. Right, and I think part of it is that our economic situation now is quite foreign to this. We rarely have such ebb and flow, unless you're a freelance worker, of income and outlay. Most people nowadays are either on a fixed income or a salaried income, and they roughly know what they're going to have most months, and they'll roughly know what their expenses are. Whereas in the ancient world, you could go months without spending a dime, or shekel as it were, because you were in the midst of a growing season. You didn't have anything to sell, and you didn't need to buy anything because you'd already stored up your food that you needed, and you mended your own clothes and did all the other things yourself, so you didn't need ready cash. And then you'd have other seasons where you needed to buy new seed supplies in order to replant. You had to buy the new plow or whatever else was needed for your farm, or you had to invest in merchandise that was going to be sold overseas and then wait for it to come back and give you the return. And during those periods, you would need cash on hand and then come back. And that cycle of having money or not having money or needing money or not needing would open up many opportunities for loans that were different than straight off gifts. Okay, but let's see what our tradition says of how our sages tried to handle this issue of, well, if I'm not going to get the money back, then I don't want to give it in the first place.
There was another system the society invented for people who didn't have money and needed to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
The indentured servant.
Correct. Correct, and that's similar to the Torah's version of slavery in most circumstances. Was much more akin to what our Western society called an indentured servant. Exactly. All right, who'd like to read a little Mishnah to start for us?
Should I read?
Sure.
Okay. A prose book is not canceled by Shemitah, the sabbatical release.
What about it? All right, prose bowl. Everybody knows that word, right? Exactly. Great Scrabble word. So a prose bowl is a legal device. It's a document that a creditor files with the Beit Din, with the court, that allows the creditor to collect after the sabbatical year. So if you have just a regular loan, sabbatical year comes along, canceled, no repayment. If you issue a prose bowl to the Beit Din for the loan, then after the sabbatical year, you can still collect on the outstanding part of the loan. It circumvents, and we'll talk about exactly what that means, it circumvents the canceling of the debt, which means the debt can continue in perpetuity.
Well, it also means that 2 months before the sabbatical year, I would be more inclined to lend money with a prose book, where 2 months before the end of the sabbatical year, no prose book. Sorry.
Keep reading.
Oh, okay. This was one of the things instituted by Hillel Hazaken, for when he saw that people were refraining from lending to one another and were transgressing that which is written in the Torah, guard yourself, lest there be in your heart an unfaithful thought, saying, the 7th year, the year of the release has approached, and you will be miserly with your needy brother, and you will not give him. Hillel then instituted the program.
Okay. So Hillel, the great Hillel, or Hillel the elder, more literally from this terminology, why did he institute this legal apparatus that would allow creditors to continue to collect from the poor even when the year of release had passed?
Because he knew how I would think. I'm not the only one.
Because he knew how people were thinking and he saw what people were doing. People were not lending. And if people didn't lend, the poor didn't have what they needed. And remember, back then, we're not talking social safety net here. There's no welfare, there's no Medicare, Medicaid, nothing. If you didn't, no food stamps, if you did not get help from other people, you would starve. You would die. And Hillel said, what's that?
Our poor aren't like these people.
Well, it depends. I mean, there certainly are cases of malnourishment and other very real hardships in this country, but we have as a society generally put in place enough protections that, generally speaking, and there's still a lot of specifics that need work, but generally speaking, it's not as bad as it was in their day. And Hillel saw that people were not lending because they knew that their money wouldn't come back to them. And he said, okay, the Torah says that you should remit the debts. But the Torah also says, beware, or guard, as this translation puts it. That's from our verse 9, right? Beware lest you harbor a base thought, or you have an unfaithful thought. And he says, that's also a mitzvah, to not be hard-hearted. how can I create a system that will keep people from being jerks, from having this hard-heartedness, from having these base thoughts? Because if it's a mitzvah to not be tight-fisted towards people in need, then I need to make sure that our society, our system is arranged in such a way that it will not encourage people to be tight-fisted, but instead will encourage them to give, and give in a way that will actually keep the poor alive. And the system that he came up with was the Prose Bowl. Keep reading and we'll see exactly how it works.
And it actually works the other way as well, because someone will therefore say they're poor and take advantage of another person because they know they will have to repay it. So it's really, I like that, it's even handy. Okay, the text of the Prose Bowl is as follows. I hand over to you, so-and-so, the judges in such and such a place, my bonds, so that I may be able to recover any money owed to me from so-and-so at any time I shall desire. And the Prose Bowl was to be signed by the judges or witnesses.
All right, so you write up this document. It says, I'm giving this Prose Bowl to you, the court, and by giving it to you, the court, I am now reserving the right to collect from Mr. So-and-so, from Plony, whenever it's needed. No, you get to overturn the Torah commandment to release the debts by filing the right paperwork?
I thought there would be a rationalization here as to how you're really...
Yeah, I mean, do I get to file paperwork to say, you know, I'm filing this paperwork with the court to reserve the right to murder so-and-so whenever I feel like it? I mean, do you get to file paperwork to violate other mitzvahs? You get to file paperwork before, you know, eating things that aren't kosher, or for breaking Shabbat, or for cheating in business, or for having adultery? Is that, you just got to file the right paperwork and then it's okay? I mean, are these like the indulgences that the Catholic Church sold? That, you know, as long as you pay the proper person, then you can get permission to nullify past transgression? Come on, this is Torah we're talking about, and now we're just doing paperwork.
Did you have to pay a fee for the baby?
Did you have to pay a fee? No. No. There is a rationalization. Read the next text.
And whatsoever of yours is with your brother shall your hand release. Oh, that would be your collateral.
No, whatever is yours, it's with your brother, which means whatever he owns, whatever he currently possesses that really belongs to you, meaning whatever is on loan,
you shall release.
Then say, it's gone. It's now his.
But not one who hands his bonds over to the court.
Okay, so the Sifrei, one of the earliest strains of Midrash, reads it like this. Whatsoever of yours is with your brother can be released. But whatsoever is with the court does not get released. So if it's yours, if it's in your hand, that is to say, if the loan is being held by you, then yes, 7th year comes along, canceled, gone. But if the loan is being held by the court, because I filed the right paperwork, then now it's not in my hands, it's in their hands. Boom, it can continue in perpetuity. So why do that?
No, but why is it okay for the court not to have to remit?
Because the mitzvah only says, according to this reading, the mitzvah only says that as long as you hold it, you have to release it. The mitzvah never says anything about whether the court holds it. So if the mitzvah is only ordering an individual to release, and not every institution in the community, then there's no violation as long as it's the court that's holding it rather than the individual. Zippity-doo-dah, this is why you have tax lawyers.
When does the court decide that they want to call in this loan?
Well, apparently the court has no say whatsoever. The way this was instituted, once it was put in place, the creditor, could demand the loan in the normal scheme of things, the way that loans would normally be demand for payment. It wasn't up to the court. So even though it was now being said the court held it, the court wasn't actually going to be involved in the process. And that, for many people, raises the question, well, this still seems like just a legal fiction. Like just a real sidestep of the Torah commandment of let go of the debt. You know, stop being a greedy jerk. And did Hillel really need to institute something that broke Torah just because people were being jerks? I mean, let them be jerks and bear the burden of their own transgression, rather than uproot something from Torah that might have helped everyone else who needed their debts to be canceled.
One more procedural. Does the creditor have to actually give the money to the court?
No.
And the court give the money?
Nope. Nope, it's
So
just
the buy
paperwork.
bonds doesn't have any real meaning.
Nope, it's paperwork. All right, and just to add insult to injury, one more line.
Said Baptista, it is Greek before the court. Pros boulay upi.
In case you were wondering where this word prosbul came from, it's a Greek word. This is a Greek legal terminology. It'd be like if you found the word, ex post facto in Aramaic. It's just taken from the legal tradition of Greek. And that's what Hillel was using. So it's not even a native Hebrew form. And we're uprooting Torah with it. It's bad enough to uproot Torah, but uprooting it with Greek words, that's even worse, right? Okay. Now we got that all good and excited about it. Let's see if we can't walk it back a little and figure out what's actually going on here and whether or not Hillel really uprooted anything and why he did what he did and what we can do when we need to. All right, onward.
Okay. Well now, is there the possibility that, on the basis of the law of the Torah, the seventh year would release the debt, but then Hillel could ordain that such a debt could not be released?
All right, so they're asking the same question that I've been trying to get you outraged over as well, which is, really? The law of the Torah says release, and Hillel comes along and institutes don't release? Is there a way for such a thing to work? Is Hillel mightier than Torah?
Says Abaya, this referred to the effects of the seventh year at this time.
At this time. Meaning, not necessarily in an earlier time. There are nowadays, and then there's how things used to be. And he'll explain the distinction in a minute.
Rabbi says, this is the manner of release by every creditor of that which he has lent his neighbor. It is of two different acts of relief that Scripture speaks. One, the release of lands, the other, the release of debts. When you release lands, you release debts. And when you do not release lands, you do not release debts.
Okay, so I've got to follow the bouncing ball of law here. So, what the rabbi is doing here, this is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, is saying you only practice the release of debts when you are also still practicing the release of land, which happens in the Jubilee every 50 years. When the practice of Jubilee is no longer in effect, then the remission of debts is likewise no longer in effect. Following it? So when you live in an age where the Jubilee still happens and the land returns to the original owners, etc., then every 7 years we practice the release of debt. But when you live in an age like ours and his, where we do not practice the release of land under the Jubilee, it is no longer implemented because of the change in society and the structure of everything at the time, then likewise we also did not practice the biblical commandment to release debts, which means debts continue in perpetuity, as does land ownership. Following that?
Are there people that today in Israel that follow this practice?
Yes and no. Great answer, right?
There are some.
Both in there, no. There are none who practice, and you got to listen carefully for the words here. There are none who practice the biblically mandated release of land, which was already nullified well back in the time of the Second Temples, because the land was no longer apportioned as it had originally been at the time of Joshua. And there are none that practice the biblically mandated release of debts or the lying fallow of the land. What word am I emphasizing on all of those? Biblically mandated. Next paragraph.
The rabbis ordained that the seventh year would continue to release debts as a memorial to the valid seventh year of temple times. So when Hillel saw that people refrained from lending one another money, he ordained a proselyte.
Okay. Even though the biblically mandated release of the land and the release of debts is no longer in effect, the rabbis said, nevertheless, we are going to make people release their debts as a reminder, as a memorial, as a heritage of when we did have to biblically. So what they did is they moved the mitzvah, they moved the command to release the debts from the biblical category, where it no longer worked because under biblical law, it was not the applicable time to be doing it because the land was not being released because of all the changes that had happened to us thanks to a myriad of conquests, and said, nevertheless, we're going to continue to require the release of debts, but we'll do it on our rabbinic authority, acknowledging that it is not biblically mandated in this day and age. Follow that shift? So biblically, there is no longer a requirement to release debts, but we as the sages of the community are going to demand it anyway. Because we would like to have that heritage of the Torah continue to be practiced even though the Bible itself no longer has the full force of making it relevant today. How are we doing? Okay? I know it's a little chicanery going on here. Having reestablished the demand that the debts would be released, when Hillel then institutes the Prose Bowl to not release the debts, he's not uprooting Torah, he's uprooting the rabbis, the other sages. And that's much easier to do. An enactment of the sages is much easier to be bypassed than a law of the Torah. How are we following the legal swerves here? So as far as Torah is concerned, living in this day and age, you don't have to release debts and you can collect forever. And the rabbi said, you know what? We're going to make people release anyway, based on our authority. As rabbis, we are going to institute what we think would be better for the community, which is demand that people still follow the release of debts, even though the Bible says you don't have to. And then Hillel comes along and says, yeah, even though the rabbi said that we do have to release them, I'm finding that people are not lending to the poor, so let's find this way around that limit and let people do it. And that is to say, still collect debts after. Follow those swerves? Okay. Except? No, trust me, it's already complicated enough. Throw a little more in, won't hurt.
Why would the rabbis need to ordain that we continue to release debts? Because the Torah already said so. What had changed?
What had changed was the rabbis believed that the remission of debts was only to take place in a day or an age when the release of the land was also taking place. That the two go together.
And does that mean when the temple stands?
It means when we reestablish the Jubilee, that yes, the Torah power, the Torah effect of releasing debts will also kick back into effect.
So, answer that question, did that all go away, the Jubilee and all of that, when the temple was destroyed or before?
First temple, yes, because Hillel lived during the Second Temple period. So we had a temple.
But it was the Second Temple already.
It was the Second Temple already, but the land was not being handled and managed according to the laws of Jubilee. That is to say, in terms of the release of the land, the returning of the land to the original owners, because that whole system had been thoroughly disrupted thanks to the conquests.
Right. Okay.
And since that was no longer in place, then the sabbatical release of debts was no longer in place. Therefore, according to the Torah, anybody could collect debts for as long as they felt like it. And so the rabbis had to reinstitute on their own authority, because the Torah authority was no longer there, that debts would still be canceled.
But not the land. Land would not return.
But land would still not return, right.
Okay, so
But
they picked what they wanted also.
In a sense, yes.
Okay.
They picked what they wanted to maintain from the original system, which was no longer operative. And having chosen to maintain the release, Hillel was then confronted with the fact that people weren't loaning, and so he found a way to go around the rabbinic enactment, which in theory, and there's some debate about this among other poskim, but in theory would mean that if it were still biblically operative that you had to release debts, not merely rabbinically ordained, Hillel's way around it wouldn't work. His prose bowl wouldn't work. It only works because he's going around his rabbinic enactment rather than the Torah commandment.
Is the land that was supposed to be fallow, was that discontinued at the same time?
So that's the element when I said yes and no in terms of what's still being practiced.
Yeah.
That's the element that is still practiced in many ways to this day in the land of Israel. So there are ways where many of the farmers and agricultural concerns in Israel will still observe the 7th year sabbatical cycle in terms of the land lying fallow. So there are elements that are still being maintained.
And when that used to occur, the Israelis often would get from Gaza the vegetables and fruits that they...
Right, there are many workarounds in the modern world, yes.
That doesn't flow as easily anymore.
Unfortunately, yes. Okay, we got miles to go before we sleep. Pressing on.
Well then, is there the possibility that on the basis of the law of the Torah, the 7th year would not release the debt, but rabbis would then ordain that such a debt could be released?
Okay, let's make sure we understand the conflict here, because I was surprised that no one shouted about this, but maybe it's because the other part was just a little too confusing. So if the Torah says that you only have to release debts while we're still doing Jubilee, and we're not doing Jubilee, and I loan Mr. Shapiro $5,000, then I can collect my $5,000 whenever I feel like it. And Mr. Shapiro is always a debtor until he pays it off. Woohoo, it's good to be a creditor, right? But the rabbis come along and tell me no, that I have to release the $5,000 I loaned to Mr. Shapiro, even though Torah says I don't. So we already were outraged that Hillel would uproot the Torah to provide release, or sorry, to avoid release. Here they're saying, yeah, but before Pruz Bowl, the rabbis were demanding release when the Torah didn't. And so if you're a creditor, you would have been a little upset about that. What gives the rabbis the right to say that Mr. Shapiro doesn't have to pay me when according to Torah you're telling me he doesn't? I mean, he does still have to pay me. Why are you doing that? Well, why are you letting him off the hook? And the answer is, we're not so much letting them off the hook as...
It is a case of sit and do nothing.
It's not that we're letting him off the hook. It's just we're not going to prosecute him for non-payment. So we're not saying that necessarily the debt is canceled. We're just saying that nobody's going to drag Mr. Shapiro into court and make him pay. It's just sit and do nothing. You know, just if he doesn't pay, it's okay. As opposed to the debt itself has actually been released. It's not a proactive step. It's an inactive step. Sometimes you can achieve things by just not doing anything. In this case, by the court not pursuing debts after the sabbatical year. Does that make sense? I mean, makes sense textually. You may disagree with the philosophy. Keep going on.
Rabbi said, what a court declares to be ownerless property is indeed ownerless property.
Rabbi had a slightly different take, and he said it's not that we're saying it's remission of debt. We're simply saying now that the property he borrowed from you doesn't belong to you anymore. And we're allowed as the rabbis to say that. You know, that we as the Beit Din could say, that nice car out there, that doesn't belong to you anymore. Because we can declare property ownerless if we so feel. Now, you may be uncomfortable with that notion, but that is authority that not only does the rabbinic court have, but so do secular courts. If the secular court believes that the property should become, let's say, the property of the state, we call that eminent domain. And good luck fighting it. The state, the community has always had and wielded this authority, hopefully with discretion, not always, to change the ownership status of property as it saw fit. If somebody borrows something from you, and you claim it was stolen and they claim it was given, and the court finds that it was given, even though you know for 100% certain truth that it was stolen from you, who does it belong to once the court has banged the gavel?
Whoever the court says.
Whoever the court says. Whoever the court says, the court always has the authority to change the status of ownership. And Rabba's simply making that explicit in this case. So deal with it. Of course we have the power to say the debts aren't being gathered anymore. Because we can say who owns whatever we want. Live with it. That's what it means to be part of a community and following the laws of the community.
Normally, when a loan is made,
Mm-hmm.
isn't there usually a time when it comes due as part of the original agreement?
Yes, exactly.
So, why don't they have to pay it off when that time comes?
Well, they do. But the question is twofold. One is if the time that it came due was farther, way away from the 7th year, but they weren't paying it off and they weren't paying it off and they drag it out to the 7th year because they continue to say they can't and they continue to maneuver in the court to avoid it, then it would still be canceled. And more importantly, or more likely, if I take out a loan 6 months before the end of the 7th, before the sabbatical year, then most loans aren't usually given with 6 month terms. And that's where people would say, well, I know this guy can't pay it back in 6 months, so I just won't loan at all. And that was the problem that Hillel was confronting, was that as the 7th year got closer, the likelihood that someone would be willing to loan you and risk you not paying it off in that short period of time became greater, and so they would just not loan at all.
Doesn't that seem okay?
Well, it seems okay unless you're one of the poor. Unless you're the guy starving in the street and saying no one's helping me because they're all afraid I won't pay him back, then you have a problem. Then you have a problem. So yes, it makes perfect sense if you're comfortable. Because why in the world should I be forced to risk my money on somebody who's not going to pay it back? And it makes tragic sense if you're the person who needs that in order to get their life started again.
And that doesn't seem fair for the person who worked hard and saved money so he had money to loan to be forced to lose it because of the sabbatical. That just doesn't seem right.
So let's take a look, and we're going to see on this last page here, which we'll go through a little bit more quickly, I guess, what the feeling is behind this, of what the rabbis are trying to emphasize in terms of our community obligations. And then we'll maybe come back to the notion of fairness.
That's conservative.
Well, we'll come back to that. Keep going.
For said Rabbi Isaac, how on the basis of scripture do we know that what is declared ownerless property by a court is validly treated as ownerless property? Whosoever did not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and the elders, all his substance shall be forfeited, and he himself separated from the congregation of the captivity.
In case you wanted an example of when the court can just say, you don't own it anymore, we have this example from Ezra. Keep going.
And a proselyte is of no avail, except for the sabbatical of debts in our day, which is of rabbinic origin. But for the sabbatical of the Torah, the proselyte is of no avail. So
Rambam wanted to emphasize what I'd already mentioned before, that what Hillel did was not uproot Torah, but was to bypass a rabbinic re-implementation of the sabbatical release. So he wasn't uprooting what the Torah said, he was uprooting the secondary level of the rabbis doing it, even though it wasn't necessary. I mean, necessary by Torah. It was necessary in their view of the society, but not by Torah.
Samuel taught, the only difference between this age and the days of the Messiah is Israel's subjugation to the kingdoms of the world alone, as it is said, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. So
Shmuel teaches that even when Mashiach comes, there will still be poor people. Because it says there will always be poor people. So what will be the difference when Mashiach comes? If not everyone, living happily ever after, the difference will be that we will no longer be under the boot of oppression of other nations. And by the way, this is one of the interpretations of what Mashiach will be like, or what the days of redemption will be like, that lead many people to think that we are either in or rapidly approaching those days, because we currently live in a world that has a free and independent state of Israel. That's not the only opinion, and there's much more to be said on that for another class. Keep going.
Said Rachia to his wife, when a poor person comes, bring him bread quickly, so that others will be quick to give bread to your children. She said to him, you're cursing them.
All right, so what's her problem here?
If I give them bread, others will give your children bread?
Meaning our children.
Our children, right, our children.
So what's the problem?
You make them
Yeah, you're wishing that my kids need to beg bread? I'm giving bread to the poor so that my kids, when they go begging, they'll get bread quickly? How could you possibly even open your mouth and utter the phrase that our children will need to beg for bread? God forbid such a thing should ever happen. Poo, poo, poo. I mean, it's this, what a terrible thing to even hint at. But his response?
So he said to her, there is a verse of Torah to that effect, because for this thing, in connection with which there is a Canaanite statement of the house of Rabbi Ishmael, what goes around comes around.
And that's a fairly good translation of what he says, which is what you do will come back. And the cycle of life continues to turn. You know, those on top will be on the bottom, and those on bottom will be on top. And you cannot predict where you, your children, your grandchildren will be on that whole turning cycle of life. And so therefore, don't presume that your children will never be poor. Your children may be. And as so, you should make sure that you are doing what is necessary now to make sure that in the long run, all the poor, including perhaps your descendants, will be well taken care of.
Rabbi Gamliel Bar Levi said, and he shall give you mercy and have compassion on you and multiply you. Whoever has mercy on other people will be shown mercy from heaven. And whoever doesn't show mercy to other people won't be shown mercy from heaven.
All right. So there is this notion in the words of the sages that what was being done here was what we call tikkun olam. I'm sure that most of you have probably heard the word tikkun olam. And generally, I imagine you probably have heard the word tikkun olam, meaning repairing the world, as an idea of ending suffering. When the rabbis used that term in the Mishnah and the Talmud, they didn't mean it the way we've come to mean it in the 20th and 21st century, of sort of a general catch-all phrase for progressive social work. What they meant by it was there are certain inequalities in society, certain pitfalls that can cause unnecessary suffering, and if we tweak the rules of society, we can prevent them. Okay, what gets called, unfortunately, dismissively as social engineering. But the rabbis were very aware that if you made the rules of the game work right, then you would be able to prevent an awful lot of suffering. And what they're saying is, in their day and age, when some of the original rules that were in place under Torah but couldn't be implemented, they needed to tweak some of the settings on the game. You know, it's kind of like changing your settings on the game of Monopoly to make sure no one ever goes bankrupt. I know everyone likes making people go bankrupt, but in real life it's not so much fun. They felt that they could make sure that suffering would be minimized. And they did so with the mindset, A, that God would bless all the endeavors of a person who was willing to show mercy on others, even when it wasn't earned. And that's what mercy means. So to answer your question, what about the people out there who are poor because, you know, I worked hard, they didn't, I deserve my money, they don't deserve my money. Yes, have mercy anyway. You're right, they don't deserve it. You're right, it's not fair that I'm demanded to help them, but it is kind. And it is that kindness that will create a society that no matter where you are, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren are on the wheel of society, they will not be crushed under that wheel. Because what you do now will help to make sure the wheel doesn't roll over anyone. And God forbid, yes, as at least this wife said, God forbid our children should ever, our children should ever be poor. But if we create a society with that in mind, that I'm creating a society that no matter what happens to my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, I know that they will not be crushed, then I'm using the right vision of how I should be treating the people who currently are on the bottom of the wheel. You look at them and say, that is my brother, that is my son, that's my grandson, and I will help them today as I would hope someone would help my actual blood relatives in the future. Then you ensure a society that will come through for everyone. And it isn't just about justice, it's about creating that sense of community, of peoplehood. It's not easy, and we can't always afford to do everything that we want to. But we should be sad and disappointed when we can't be as kind as we want, rather than sit back and say, well, I did what they deserved. Take care, everyone. You can read the final quote on your own. It's a wonderful reminder that someone who has the capacity to help another but does not, it is as if they worship idols. It is of the same severity in the view of Torah.